the C&E Trail was the main road, and it had a lot of it was used by a lot of people, a lot of traffic. Basically follows a trail from Lone Pine, which is near Bowden, today's Bowden, from Lone Pine to Edmonton, whereas Edmonton was the main supply place in the early days, the first supply place in Alberta, and it was called the Wolf Track, and there was lots of native trails. They went all over the country, but the Wolf Track mainly came from Edmonton south to the Red Deer Crossing. There was a good ford at Red Deer, just west of Red Deer City, and it came down through what is now Innisfail, and it went just east of Bowden and east of Olds and continued on to Calgary. After 1883, when the railroad came to Calgary, immediately everything changed in Alberta. Everything used to come from the north, then all the freight and the mail, everything went north because of the railroad. And so then the branch from Lone Pine to Calgary was established, and it was really only used for about 8 or 9 years until the Calgary-Edmonton Railroad was built, and then everything came on the railroad. But in those years, it was used extensively. Like all the early homesteaders came up the trail. Troops and supplies for the Riel Rebellion used the trail. It was very well used. The stagecoach ran on it from 1884 from Calgary to Edmonton. 1 week it went to Edmonton, the next week it went back to Calgary, and it carried the mail. And it was a very important route. Along the Edmonton Trail were stopping houses, and there was several. There's one just north of Airdrie, Stevenson stopping house. There was one at east of Carstairs called Scarlett's stopping house. There was one just northeast of Olds called Steamboat Landing, and then one southeast of Bowden, which was Lone Pine. They offered food and lodging, I guess, and it was pretty crude to today's standards, but from Lone Pine south there was very little wood, so it was pretty tough traveling. It wasn't very user-friendly, the old trails. So, and those places had you would usually get a meal of some kind and a place to sleep. And if it was cold, everybody slept inside. If it wasn't cold, I guess a lot of people slept outside or under the wagon or in a tent. They were also places where they could change horses. And I know that Lone Pine had a huge big corral, because when I was young, an old timer took me down there, and you could see in the outline of where the corral had been. And so they kept horses there so they could trade fresh horses to carry on up the trail or down the trail. So the only town really is Innisfail that is basically right on the trail. I'm not so sure about further north of the river because I don't know, but I know it goes almost right through Lacombe, and I would guess maybe Pinoka too, but somewhere up between Black Falls and Lacombe there's a sign that says C&E Trail. They used sleighs in the winter, and they used sleighs on the stagecoach as long as there was snow. And an old timer told me that they always left a wagon at Lone Pine, and if it didn't look like there was enough snow, because Lone Pine, like a lot of times south towards Calgary, we don't have a lot of snow in the winter, so they would trade and use the wagon south to Calgary and the sleigh from Lone Pine north. I would guess that from about April till July, it was pretty limited use, because there was a lot of rain in those days, and when the spring breakup came, it was probably almost impassable. But in any of the early pictures you see, there's lots of mud and there's lots of ruts. And right where the Lone Pine Stopping House was, those ruts are still visible today, and those are the ones that Dale Lenting had the pictures of. From summer till the next spring, it was used extensively, and if the trail got too bad or too rutty, they would just move over and find a new spot that was a little solider. All of the old trails followed the high ground. Like, they wandered around because they stayed basically on the hilltops or on higher ground. And that's noticeable even today between Innisfail and Red Deer. The C&E trail follows, it stays away from the wet ground. If you notice, it's on the side of the hills or on the higher ground. And it's that way all the way south. The land was surveyed very early, like right after the fur traders in Western Canada. There were surveyors, and the first surveyors put in township lines. Like, they didn't do sections as such, but they mapped out the country, and I think they picked out the better land, because they would survey a chunk like just around Olds, and north and west of Olds is really good land, and it was surveyed really early. West of Innisfail, where the old Sinclair house come from, was surveyed really early. And because the government wanted homesteaders, and so they advertised in Ontario and in the States and for homesteaders to come and get basically free land. And they did. They came by the hundreds, and in 10 years, a lot of the country along the trail and along the railroad was settled. And but there was no such. They just followed the trail. They followed the old Indian trails, and there was no maintenance or anything. Eventually, a private guy did start a ferry at the Red Deer crossing, built a ferry there, and he charged a toll to cross, because the Red Deer River was always a big obstacle, especially in the spring and early summer. And but people were pretty hardy in those days. Like, they struck out, with a few groceries and an axe and a gun, and made their way. The stagecoach, they tried to be to Edmonton by Friday. They'd leave early Monday, and Red Deer basically is halfway. So I'm guessing that, and I would guess that probably Lone Pine would have been the end of the second day. I think coming from Calgary. That's about 60 miles, and 30 miles with a wagon is a long day. 25 is more a regular day, but the stagecoach, I'm sure, it was 4 horses, and it was pretty a light wagon. They didn't haul much freight. They hauled passengers and luggage and the mail. So, and a 4-horse outfit, would go a little faster. So, and I'm sure in the winter sometimes when the sleighing was really good, they would trot along and probably made it in 4.5 days or something, but and they knew where the crossings were. Like, there's crossings on these rivers all along, and all those native trails go to the crossings. And well, it was just hundreds of years of knowing where to go. They created those trails, and because the natives in southern Alberta in the early days traded at Rocky Mountain House, and they also traded at Edmonton. Even the Blackfoot traded at Edmonton. And like the Red Deer River is supposedly the border between the Cree and the Blackfoot, but they would go to Edmonton and trade, and of course they sometimes battled too. I don't have much on the history of that, but they would jump across the river, young men, and steal horses and steal women, but stealing women and horses was considered a proper thing to do in their culture, So, and when the Riel Rebellion started, there was quite a few Cree around Red Deer, along the river, and Métis people, and they were showing some unrest. And that's why the government were worried, and that's why they got together a troop, and they came up the trail. And then in the meantime, they sent Mount Royal Rifles, which were, I think, from Montreal. They sent them on the train to Calgary. They came up the trail, and they came to Red Deer Crossing and commandeered McClellan's stopping house and fortified it, and it was the first Fort Normando. And but they were worried. They didn't seem to be worried in southern Alberta, because Crowfoot was on reserve, and he wouldn't let the Blackfoot fight. From 1883 to 1891, the trail was used a lot, and all the homesteaders, because the land was being surveyed, and a lot of, like around Red Deer, those people went there in 1882 and 3, and right up to 1900, and everywhere north, and as far as Bowden and Olds, those people all come up the trail.
Leonard Gates was a Nova Scotian, came from Middle Musquodoboit, Nova Scotia. He had gone into the ministry, and actually was a magnificent orator. Actually, he was one of the people that was asked to speak at the celebrations of Confederation on July 1st, 1867 in Halifax, because although he was quite a young man at the time, his reputation as a magnificent speaker had already been advanced. His wife, Carolyn, was a very highly educated person. She had gone to university at a time in which a lot of women did not. So a very highly educated, very bright person. And they had a wonderful partnership. And first of all, a number of small charges or mission fields in Atlantic Canada, but as time went on, he ended up at being at one of the major churches in Montreal, St. James Methodist, which was considered one of the epitomes of a ministerial career. But then everything kind of fell apart on him, because he was diabetic at the time before insulin. His health broke down. They had 10 children. He moved to a small hardscrabble farm down by Hamilton, and then I think we had another one after that. And really in rough shape because his health was bad. They were trying to make a living on a farm that couldn't support such a large family. But there was an organization called the Saskatchewan Land and Homestead Company. It was a lot of prominent Methodist business people from Ontario who saw the advantages of helping develop Western Canada. So they created this land company. And they bought 180 sections of land. So it's 180 times 640 acres of land in and around Red Deer. And the idea was they would bring people out, mainly Methodist, but also from other denominations, and settle them here on a field there. But they needed a good local agent and a good local promoter. So they went to speak to Leonard Gates and said, would you like to try a new career and a new life out in the West? I mean, you'll be remote, but maybe you can start a new life. So he came out here, was given a piece of land in what's now downtown Red Deer, a very fertile place. And his health really improved, probably with the, there's a lot of truth to eat organic, or as our organic food, or as our grandparents call it, food. Because things that they raised, a lot of good physical work, a lot of healthy diet. And he and his wife built a new home in Red Deer, and was a tremendous promoter of the area, and developed a very successful farm. Actually, he was such a good speaker, the Calgary Herald once wrote that after a speech he gave, he said his words were so powerful that they were worthy of being written with pens of iron onto plates of brass. Now that must be quite a speech. Anyway, another thing that he did was when he came here, he was penniless. His health had broken down. They had another child. His wife was expecting when he came out here in 1884. And so they had 11 children, and they're building a life, and they did manage to do well. But in 1890, when they were building the railroad from Calgary to Edmonton, Leonard Gates was quite shrewd, because he said to the railroad company, if you build the railroad and build it across my farm, I will give you half my farm for a town site. But he was quite careful, because he didn't sort of cut it in half and say, okay, I'll keep this side of the road as my farm and that side will be the town site. It was a 50% interest. So the railroad company thought, well, that was great. They got this interest in this good piece of flat land along the river for a town site. But it's also great for Leonard Gates, because every time a lot was sold in the new town site, when Red Deer sprang up in 1891-92 as the railroad was finished, half the money went to the railroad company, town site company, but half went to the Gateses. And so he went from a man who was penniless, struggling, trying to build a farm on a raw agricultural frontier, but at the same time promoting a land company to try and bring other people here, to a man who did extremely well. He said, there's gates on every corner. There's a gates in every corner. There's gates on every stair. If balloons become the fashion, we'll have Gateses in the air. There are a lot of Gateses. And anyway, with the town site coming, they named the main thoroughfare, north and south one, Gates Avenue, in honor of the man whose land it was. The main east-west one, Ross Avenue or Ross Street, was named after Sir James Ross, who was one of the chief people in the railroad company. And anyway, Leonard and Carolyn Gates then did very well. So that when they had 6 daughters, and as each daughter got married, they had enough money that they were able to give them a couple of lots and a house on 56th Street as a wedding present. And that was why 56th Street in the early days was nicknamed Son-in-Law Avenue, because that was the retirement home for the Gateses. But there were also a lot of Gates daughters and their husbands and families. Actually a pretty shrewd idea, because you'd have your daughters and your grandchildren around for visits and for support, but also you can send them home easily when it's time. Tragically, Mrs. Gates had a heart attack while getting ready for a big family Christmas dinner in 1906. And actually, she might have survived that. She was actually carrying the turkey platter when she got sick, put her in a chair, but somebody got the idea to put a hot mustard compress on her chest because she was, well, that turned what might have been a bad heart attack into a fatal one. And poor Leonard Gates, he was absolutely heartbroken. He'd lost his life partner, the true love of his life. He already was diabetic and his health was deteriorating. So she died at Christmas time. He died in June. He did last more than a few weeks after she did. But they left a great legacy. And when they did the sculptures, they unveiled one on the intersection of Ross Street and Gates Avenue, right in the heart of downtown area. It was a picture of Leonard Gates sitting on a bench, looking at the town that he helped create. The likeness is based on old photographs. Now, I never knew Leonard Gates. He died in 1907, so long before I was around. But he certainly looks like a lot of the pictures I've seen of him. But one cute story about when they unveiled the sculpture, it was quite a cold day, and Gail Sirkin was our mayor at the time, and so she cut the ribbon, and there were all the dignitaries and family gathered around for the ceremony. And then one of the reporters said, well, why don't you sit on his lap? And so Gail Sirkin's quite spunky and always up to a good chow, so she jumped on his lap and put her arm around him. But then one of the family yelled out, for God's sakes, don't kiss him, because when you have something metal, and if you have wet lips, and it's really cold, you can end stuck on that metal for some time. So I always remember the calling out as she was sitting there, and someone said, for God's sakes, don't kiss him, because we might have to pry you off afterwards. So really a landmark. Again, really something that people really connect with, because sometimes in really cold weather you see someone wrap a scarf around his neck or do other little things. Just really connect, because it's a very human scale. It's a good likeness and something that's quite popular.